Hey guys, tonight we are setting sail, not on a thrilling adventure of discovery and conquest, but on a far more authentic Viking experience. We're embarking on the truly crushing monotony of a long Viking sea voyage. Imagine, if you will, the pre-dawn chill. It's not the crisp, invigorating cold of a winter morning on land. No. This is a damp, clinging chill that seeps into your bones, carrying with it the salt spray from last night's choppy waves, and the faint, ever-present smell of wet wool, and something vaguely fishy that you've long since stopped trying to identify. You're huddled on a hard wooden bench, or perhaps curled up in a sliver of space between a snoring shipmate and a pile of damp rope. And as the first gray light reluctantly seeps over the endless horizon, you realize with a familiar, sinking feeling, it's another day. Another day that will be almost identical to the last, and terrifyingly similar to the one that will follow. If you think a long commute in rush-hour traffic is tedious, or that a transatlantic flight in economy class is an exercise in endurance, you probably wouldn't last a week. Let alone the weeks or months these Norsemen spent cooped up on their longships with nothing but water, sky, and truly terrible rations. It was a masterclass in enduring the mundane. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, why not post your location and local time in the comments below? It's always rather comforting to know where in the world my fellow history nappers are drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first conscious sensation, even before you fully open your eyes, is the dampness. It's in the air, on your clothes, in the rough blanket pulled up to your chin. It's a constant companion on these voyages. A reminder that you are a tiny speck of humanity on a vast, indifferent ocean. You stir, your muscles stiff and protesting from another night spent in a contorted position. There's a collective groan from your shipmates as they too begin to surface from whatever brief oblivion sleep might have offered. No one greets the dawn with cheer. It's more of a weary acknowledgement, a silent resignation to the inevitable routine that awaits. The rhythm of the waves, the creak of the timbers, the sigh of the wind in the sail. These are the sounds that have filled your ears for days, perhaps weeks, and they will continue, an unending, monotonous symphony of the sea. You might think of Viking voyages as being packed with stirring sagas and brave deeds, but the vast majority of the time was spent in a state of suspended animation, a gray limbo between departure and arrival. The more in tonight's title refers to all those little discomforts, those tiny persistent irritations that, when compounded over weeks at sea, could grind down even the hardiest Norse spirit into a state of profound, soul-crushing boredom. It's a known historical fact that these voyages, whether for trade, exploration, or raiding, could last for extended periods, often far longer than initially planned due to unpredictable weather or navigational challenges. And every extra day at sea meant another day of enduring the same cramped conditions, the same bland food, and the same endless, watery view. Historians still argue about the exact psychological impact of such prolonged exposure to monotony and confinement on Viking crews. Did it foster a grim stoicism, or did it lead to frayed tempers and simmering resentments? Probably a bit of both, depending on the length of the voyage and the quality of the ship's ale, if any was left. A quirky tidbit is that Vikings, despite their fearsome reputation, were also prone to seasickness, just like any other landlubber. Imagine the misery. Not only are you bored out of your skull, but you're also trying not to revisit your meager breakfast onto your neighbor's boots. It's a far cry from the heroic depictions. This gritty, uncomfortable reality of just being there, on the water, waiting, and waiting, as you slowly, painfully, unkink your limbs. You become acutely aware of the defining characteristic of life aboard a Viking longship on a lengthy voyage. the almost complete lack of personal space. These vessels, while marvels of naval engineering for their time, were designed for speed, flexibility, and carrying capacity, not for creature comforts. You are packed in like salted herring in a barrel, shoulder to shoulder, knee to back, with your fellow voyagers. There is, quite literally, no room to swing a cat, and certainly not enough room to swing an axe without endangering several of your companions, which, given the mounting boredom, might occasionally seem like a tempting proposition, if only for a moment's diversion. Your sleeping quarters, if you can even call them that, are wherever you can find a few square feet of relatively flat, or at least not too sharply angled, deck space. This usually means wedging yourself between rowing benches, cargo chests, or other sleeping bodies. At night, the deck becomes a tangled mass of humanity, a jigsaw puzzle of limbs and snores. If you need to answer nature's call in the middle of the night, a grim prospect involving a designated spot at the rail, and a prayer you don't slip, you'll be clambering over a dozen of your snoring, grumbling shipmates, each one a potential trip hazard in the dark. It's a mainstream historical fact that longships, especially the larger warships or those laden with trade goods, could carry scores of men. While some might have had a small tent-like structure or a slightly more sheltered area aft for the chieftain or captain, the vast majority of the crew lived and slept exposed to the elements, or under a simple canvas awning if they were lucky and the weather permitted. The concept of privacy is a distant, almost forgotten dream. Every bodily function, every moment of discomfort, every whispered conversation, if you could even manage one without 3 other people hearing it, is essentially a public event. You eat, sleep, work, and exist in a state of constant, unavoidable proximity to others. There's no retiring to your cabin for a quiet read. There are no cabins, and probably nothing much to read anyway, unless you count staring at the intricate, but by now mind-numbingly familiar carvings on the dragon prow. Historians still argue about how Vikings managed the social dynamics in such incredibly cramped conditions for weeks on end. Were there strict unwritten rules about personal conduct and respecting what little space one had? Or did minor irritations frequently flare into arguments, suppressed only by the need for communal survival? The sagas hint at both camaraderie and conflict. A quirky and rather smelly tidbit relates to the storage of everything: food, water, weapons, tools, personal belongings, what few you might have. And any trade goods or plunder are all stashed wherever they can fit, often under the same benches where you row by day and try to sleep by night. This means you might be using a sack of dried fish as a pillow, or find your spare pair of equally damp socks nestled next to a pile of walrus tusks. The organization, while perhaps efficient in terms of space utilization, certainly didn't lend itself to a tidy or comfortable living environment. You can just imagine the quiet desperation of trying to find something in the dim light, rummaging through a jumble of communal clutter, all while being jostled by the ship's motion and the equally restless movements of your shipmates. It's an exercise in claustrophobic patience, a constant reminder that on this long, monotonous voyage, your personal bubble has shrunk to roughly the size of your own skin. And sometimes, even that feels a bit too crowded. Now, let's address an aspect of this Viking sea voyage that your nose would have registered long before your conscious mind fully processed the cramped quarters. The smell. Oh, the unforgettable, unique, and utterly pervasive aroma of a longship weeks out from land. It's not a single identifiable scent, but rather a rich, complex bouquet, a symphony of olfactory experiences that would cling to your clothes, your hair, and your very soul, probably for weeks after you finally made landfall, assuming you ever did. If you're picturing the fresh, briny tang of the sea, well, that's part of it. But it's a mere background note in a much more pungent orchestra. The dominant fragrance, the one that forms the base of this olfactory tapestry, is likely tar. It's a well-established historical fact that Viking ships were meticulously caulked and waterproofed with animal hair and tar, usually pine tar. This sticky black substance was essential for keeping the seawater out, but it also exuded a strong resinous odor that would permeate every plank of wood and every fiber of fabric on board. On a hot day, the tar might soften and release its scent even more powerfully. On a cold, damp day, it would be a sharp, acrid note in the air. Then, of course, there's the salt. Salt spray constantly coats the ship, crystallizing on surfaces, making everything feel slightly gritty and taste faintly of the ocean. This salty tang mixes with the tar, creating a uniquely maritime perfume. But we're just getting started. Add to this the smell of unwashed bodies. Dozens of men, living in close proximity, working hard, sweating, with extremely limited opportunities for bathing, if any at all on a long voyage. Fresh water was too precious to be wasted on washing anything but mouths, and perhaps occasionally faces. So, the natural, earthy aroma of human effort, shall we say, would become an increasingly prominent feature of the shipboard atmosphere. And let's not forget the lovely scent of stale bilge water. No matter how well built the ship, some water would inevitably seep in or splash over the sides, collecting in the bilge at the bottom of the hull. This water, mixed with whatever dirt, food scraps, and other detritus found its way down there, would quickly become stagnant and foul-smelling, a constant gurgling reminder of the less glamorous side of seafaring. Remember the bailing chores we'll get to? That's where this delightful concoction comes from. Historians still debate the specifics of Viking hygiene at sea, but the consensus is that it was, by modern standards, rudimentary at best. A quirky and rather stomach-turning tidbit is the smell of stored food, particularly if it wasn't perfectly preserved. Dried fish, salted meat, hardtack biscuits, even when properly stored, these items had their own distinct, often strong, odors. If any of it started to spoil, or became infested with weevils, a common shipboard companion, the resulting smell would add another unwelcome layer to the already potent mix. You might also catch a whiff of damp wool, decaying rope, perhaps even the faint metallic tang of stored weapons. It's a full-bodied, three-dimensional aroma, one that would be the first thing to greet you in the morning, and the last thing you'd smell before succumbing to an uneasy, fume-filled sleep. You can almost imagine a Viking, stepping ashore after weeks at sea, being told by a land dweller, "By Odin's beard, man, you reek like a troll's armpit after a wrestling match with a wet dog in a tar pit." And he'd probably just shrug, too accustomed to his own unique bouquet to even notice. All right, you've woken up cold and damp, navigated the human obstacle course of your sleeping shipmates, and your nostrils are now fully acquainted with the ship's signature scent. What's next in this thrilling daily routine? Breakfast, of course, or what passes for breakfast on a Viking longship weeks into a voyage. If you're dreaming of a hearty meal to fuel your day of, well, mostly just sitting and staring at the ocean, you're in for a rude awakening. Prepare your palate for the utterly unappetizing and relentlessly repetitive nature of Viking sea rations. The star of the show, the unyielding backbone of your diet, is likely to be some form of dried, preserved food. It's a mainstream historical fact that Vikings relied heavily on provisions that could last for long periods without refrigeration. This meant dried fish, cod, haddock, or herring, air-dried until it was as hard as a plank of wood. To make it even remotely edible, you might have to soak it in seawater, if fresh water was scarce, or bash it with a rock before gnawing on its salty, chewy blandness. Accompanying this delicacy would be hardtack, or ship's biscuit. This wasn't your fluffy, buttery biscuit from a modern bakery. Oh no. This was a simple, unleavened bread made from flour, water, and perhaps a little salt, baked until it was incredibly hard and dry to prevent spoilage. Eating it often involved soaking it in whatever liquid was available. Water, weak ale if you were lucky, or even just saliva, to soften it enough not to break your teeth. And yes, it was probably crawling with weevils. Consider them extra protein. Meat, if you had any, would also be preserved, likely salted or dried. Salted pork or mutton, tough and intensely salty, would require prolonged soaking to make it palatable, and even then, it would be a far cry from a succulent roast. You might also have some dried fruits or nuts, if the voyage was well provisioned initially, but these would be doled out sparingly. And cheese? Remember our discussion on Viking cheese-making being a grim chore? If you had cheese, it was likely a hard, dry, and intensely flavored variety, designed for longevity rather than gourmet delight. The overall theme is dry, salty, hard, and bland. Variety is not on the menu. You might eat the same combination of dried fish and hardtack for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, for weeks on end. Imagine the sheer, soul-crushing monotony of it. Oh good, you'd think with a notable lack of enthusiasm. Another delightful serving of rock-hard bread and fish that tastes vaguely of old socks. Historians still argue about the nutritional adequacy of the Viking diet on long voyages. While preserved foods could prevent starvation, they were often lacking in essential vitamins, which could lead to deficiency diseases like scurvy if the voyage was particularly protracted and fresh provisions couldn't be obtained. A quirky and rather unappetizing tidbit is that sometimes, in dire straits, Vikings might have resorted to eating things that would make a modern stomach churn. Perhaps even the less desirable parts of any animals they managed to catch or had brought along. And drinking water. That was a precious commodity, often stored in wooden barrels where it could quickly become stale, slimy, or contaminated. It might be rationed carefully, tasting of wood tannins and general unpleasantness. You can almost feel the texture of that dry biscuit scraping your tongue, the lingering saltiness of the fish, the lukewarm, slightly off-tasting water. It's a culinary experience designed not for pleasure, but for grim survival, another layer in the crushing monotony of your long, watery journey. Your taste buds would have given up and gone into hibernation weeks ago. So you've choked down your, let's generously call it sustenance. And now the vast expanse of the day stretches before you, as empty and unchanging as the view from the ship. What do you do? Well, mostly, you stare. You stare out at the endless ocean, and you stare up at the endless sky. Day after mind-numbing day, the scenery, or rather, the distinct lack of it, remains stubbornly, crushingly, the same. This is perhaps the purest distillation of the monotony we're exploring tonight. The sheer, unadulterated visual boredom of being adrift in a world of blue and gray. Imagine your vantage point. You're on a relatively low-slung longship, meaning your horizon isn't dramatically distant. All around you, in every direction, is water. Sometimes it's calm, a vast shimmering sheet of glass reflecting the sky. Other times it's choppy, a restless field of gray or green peaks and troughs, marching endlessly towards a horizon that never seems to get any closer. The waves rise and fall, the ship rises and falls with them, but the overall picture remains static. There are no landmarks, no familiar coastlines, no friendly plumes of smoke from a distant village, just water. It's a well-established historical fact that the Vikings were master seafarers, capable of navigating vast stretches of open ocean, like the North Atlantic. But this mastery came at the cost of enduring immense periods where the only view was this watery void. Above you, the sky. Sometimes it's a clear, brilliant blue, offering no solace from the sun's glare. Other times, it's a thick, oppressive blanket of gray cloud, mirroring the dullness of the sea below and, quite possibly, your mood. You might watch the clouds drift and change shape, a desperate attempt to find some fleeting pattern or distraction in their slow, ponderous dance. But even clouds, after a while, become just another feature of the unchanging backdrop. At night, if the sky is clear, you'll have the stars, a breathtaking canopy of infinite lights. And while beautiful, even their familiar constellations, wheeling slowly overhead night after night, can become just another part of the relentless cycle, another reminder of time passing without any discernible progress. Historians still debate the psychological techniques, if any, that Viking sailors might have employed to cope with such profound sensory monotony. Did they engage in storytelling, sing songs, or play simple games to break the tedium? We'll touch on that later. But for much of the time, particularly if the weather was foul or spirits were low, it's easy to imagine a crew lapsing into a kind of apathetic silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, or perhaps trying very hard not to think at all. A quirky and rather bleak observation is that even the most stunning natural phenomena, a particularly vibrant sunset, the ethereal glow of the northern lights, if they were far enough north, might eventually lose their power to awe, becoming just another fleeting event in an ocean of sameness. You can feel your own eyes starting to glaze over, can't you? The gentle rocking of the ship, the endless expanse of water, the distant hazy line where sea meets sky. It's a perfect recipe for a kind of waking hypnosis, a dulling of the senses that makes it very, very easy to just drift. Your eyelids feel heavy already, don't they? Just the vast, empty, endlessly repeating seascape, stretching on and on and on. Now, lest you think a long Viking sea voyage was simply an exercise in passive staring and contemplating the infinite, let me assure you, there were chores. Oh yes, there were chores. Tedious, constant, and often physically demanding chores that were absolutely vital for the survival of the ship and everyone on board. These weren't the sort of tasks that offered much in the way of intellectual stimulation or a sense of grand accomplishment. Rather, they were the relentless, grinding background hum of shipboard life, another layer of monotony that you simply had to endure. One of the most crucial and least glamorous of these tasks was bailing. Remember that delightful bilge water we discussed earlier? That fragrant soup collecting at the bottom of the hull? Well, it didn't remove itself. It's a mainstream historical fact that even the best-built wooden ships of the Viking Age would take on some water, whether through small leaks in the hull, waves washing over the gunwales in rough seas, or even just heavy rain. If this water wasn't regularly removed, the ship would become heavier, slower, less maneuverable, and eventually, catastrophically swamped. So, day in and day out, in shifts, members of the crew would be assigned the unenviable task of bailing, using wooden buckets or scoops to laboriously lift the sloshing, foul-smelling water from the bilge and heave it overboard. It was wet, smelly, back-breaking work, and as soon as you finished, it felt like the bilge was already starting to fill up again. An endless, thankless cycle. Then there was the maintenance of the sail and rigging. The large, square sail of a longship was its primary engine, and it, along with the ropes, rigging, that controlled it, was under constant stress from the wind and weather. Tears in the sailcloth, made of wool or linen, had to be patched. Frayed ropes needed to be spliced or replaced. Wooden spars or yardarms might crack and require reinforcement. This was often fiddly, repetitive work, done with basic tools like needles, awls, and knives, frequently in awkward positions, perhaps while clinging to the mast or yardarm as the ship pitched and rolled. You can imagine a Viking, squinting in the sun, patiently stitching a patch onto a flapping sail, the rhythmic pass of the needle through the coarse fabric a small, monotonous counterpoint to the larger rhythms of the sea. Historians still argue about the precise division of labor on Viking ships, and whether specific roles were permanently assigned, or if tasks were rotated among the crew. It's likely a combination, with some experienced individuals perhaps overseeing navigation or steering, while more general duties were shared. A quirky and rather unappetizing chore that might fall to someone was galley duty, if you could even call it a galley. Cooking, such as it was, often involved a simple firebox, a stone-lined hearth, sometimes filled with sand, where a cauldron could be heated to boil water or stew the preserved rations. Keeping this fire going safely on a wooden ship, preparing the meager meals,
and then cleaning the greasy, soot-stained cooking pot was another repetitive, unrewarding task. And let's not forget keeping watch. Day and night, someone had to be alert for changes in weather, navigational hazards, like unexpected rocks or ice, or, depending on the nature of the voyage, signs of other ships. This required sustained attention, even when there was nothing to see but that endless expanse of water, which, as we've established, was most of the time. It's the kind of focused boredom that can be incredibly draining. All these chores, from the strenuous to the subtle, filled the hours, not with excitement, but with a dull, necessary routine, a constant battle against the encroaching chaos of the sea and the inevitable decay of the vessel. Underpinning every moment of your existence on this Viking longship, whether you're engaged in a tedious chore, attempting to choke down your rations, or simply staring into the void, is the relentless motion of the vessel itself. The gentle, or sometimes not so gentle, rocking, pitching, and rolling is a constant companion, an inescapable physical reality that your body must perpetually adjust to. For some, this ceaseless movement might eventually become a soothing, hypnotic lullaby, gently rocking them into a state of drowsy acceptance. For others, it's a one-way ticket to nausea and misery. It's a well-established historical fact that longships, with their shallow drafts and flexible construction, were designed to ride the waves rather than plow through them like heavier, more rigid vessels. This made them incredibly seaworthy and capable of navigating coastal waters and even being beached. But it also meant they were particularly lively in even moderate seas. The ship would rise and fall with each swell, tilt from side to side, roll, and seesaw from bow to stern, pitch. This complex, three-dimensional movement was unceasing. Even when the sea appeared relatively calm, there would be a subtle, underlying sway, a constant reminder that you were afloat. Imagine trying to perform any task under these conditions. Eating becomes a balancing act, trying to keep your food from sliding off whatever makeshift surface you're using. Walking even a few steps across the deck requires a sailor's practiced gait, anticipating the ship's next lurch. And sleeping? That's an adventure in itself, trying to wedge yourself into a position where you won't be rolled out of your meager space with every significant wave. You might find yourself instinctively bracing your feet against a bench or a bulkhead, even in your sleep, your muscles unconsciously working to maintain equilibrium. This constant, subtle physical exertion, even if you're not consciously aware of it, can be surprisingly tiring over days and weeks. Historians still debate the prevalence and severity of seasickness among Viking crews. While experienced sailors likely developed their sea legs relatively quickly, new recruits or those less accustomed to the ocean were almost certainly afflicted. Remember that earlier mention of Vikings being prone to it? The sagas occasionally mention warriors being incapacitated by seasickness, a rather unheroic image. A quirky and rather unpleasant detail for those suffering from seasickness would be the complete lack of anywhere to escape the motion. There's no going below deck to a stable bunk on a typical longship. You're right there in the open, feeling every single dip and sway, with the added olfactory delights we've already discussed. For those susceptible, the constant rocking wouldn't be a gentle lullaby, but a relentless torment, turning the already monotonous voyage into a truly wretched experience. But even for the hardy, the unceasing motion becomes a part of the background fabric of life, a rhythm so ingrained that when you finally step onto solid land, the world itself might feel strangely, unnervingly still. For now, though, you're a creature of the waves, your body swaying in time with the ancient, indifferent pulse of the ocean, a rhythm that, if you just let it, might very well rock you gently, gently, into a deep, sea-lulled sleep. Just feel it, rocking, swaying. Now, as your body sways with the ship, your mind might idly wonder, how in Odin's name do we even know where we're going? In an age long before GPS, satellite navigation, or even the widespread use of the magnetic compass in Europe,
finding your way across vast, featureless stretches of open ocean was an art form, a science, and quite frankly, a significant amount of sheer guesswork. The monotony of staring at the sea was occasionally punctuated by the anxiety and focused effort of trying to discern your position and heading, a process that was itself often repetitive and reliant on subtle, easily obscured cues. It's a mainstream historical fact that Viking navigators primarily relied on the sun and stars. During the day, the position of the sun at different times, its height at noon, its bearing at sunrise and sunset, could give a rough indication of latitude and direction, provided the sky was clear. They may have used simple tools like a sunstone, thought to be a type of polarizing crystal like Iceland spar, to locate the sun's position even on overcast days, or a sun shadow board to track its path. At night, the pole star, North Star, was a crucial fixed point for determining north, and other constellations could be used as guides. This required an intimate knowledge of the celestial sphere, a mental map of the heavens that had to be consulted constantly. Imagine the navigator, night after night, craning his neck, squinting at the distant pinpricks of light, trying to pick out familiar patterns amidst the overwhelming multitude, the ship's motion making even this simple act a challenge. But what happened when the sun was obscured by thick clouds for days on end, or when fog rolled in, swallowing the ship in a damp, gray embrace? This is where other, less precise methods came into play. Experienced navigators would pay close attention to wave patterns, wind direction, which could be surprisingly consistent in certain areas, the flight paths of migratory birds, which often indicated the direction of land, and even the color and temperature of the water, or the types of seaweed or driftwood encountered. These were subtle, often ambiguous signs, requiring immense experience and intuition to interpret correctly. It was a constant low-level state of observation, trying to read the language of the ocean itself. Historians still argue about the exact navigational tools and techniques available to the Vikings and their level of sophistication. While sagas mention things like sunstones, concrete archaeological evidence is scarce, leading to ongoing debate. A quirky and rather anxiety-inducing tidbit is the concept of dead reckoning. Essentially, estimating your position based on your last known location, your estimated speed and direction of travel, and the time elapsed. As you can imagine, this method is prone to accumulating errors. A slight miscalculation in speed, a subtle shift in current, and unaccounted for drift due to wind. All these could throw you miles off course over a long voyage, leading to the very real possibility of missing your intended landfall entirely and sailing off into even more endless ocean. You can picture the navigator, hunched over his mental map, muttering calculations, occasionally glancing nervously at the sky or the waves, the weight of the crew's survival resting heavily on his ability to decipher these faint, fleeting clues. It's another form of monotony, this constant, watchful uncertainty, a quiet hum of anxiety beneath the louder roar of the wind and waves, a slow, repetitive process of observation and deduction, with very high stakes. So, there you are, rocking gently on the endless sea, having perhaps just endured another uninspiring meal. The navigator is squinting at a patch of sky that may or may not contain the sun. What else is there to break the visual monotony? Well, you might engage in a bit of wildlife spotting. But don't get your hopes up for a Viking equivalent of a whale-watching tour, complete with David Attenborough narration. For the most part, wildlife spotting on a long Viking sea voyage was likely a fairly uneventful affair, mostly involving gulls. Lots and lots of gulls. Seabirds, particularly gulls, would have been a common sight, especially when the ship was relatively close to land, or sailing over shallower, fish-rich waters. You might see them circling overhead, their raucous cries a familiar, if not entirely welcome sound. They'd follow the ship, hoping for scraps of discarded food, or perhaps just curious. You'd watch them wheel and dive, their effortless flight a stark contrast to your own lumbering, water-bound progress. After a while, though, even gulls become just
Gulls. Another white shape against the blue or gray, their calls blending into the general soundscape of the voyage. It's a well-established historical fact that the presence and behavior of seabirds were used by Viking navigators as potential indicators of land. Certain types of birds only venture so far from shore, so an increase in their numbers, or seeing them flying purposefully in a particular direction at dawn or dusk, could suggest that land was near. So your idle birdwatching might occasionally have a more serious purpose, a flicker of hope in the otherwise bird-brained monotony. Occasionally, you might be treated to something more exciting. A pod of dolphins or porpoises might playfully escort the ship for a while, their sleek bodies leaping from the waves. This would undoubtedly be a welcome diversion, a moment of genuine delight and connection with another form of life in this vast emptiness. Whales, too, would have been sighted. Imagine the awe, and perhaps a little fear, of seeing one of these immense creatures breach the surface nearby, its great fluke disappearing back into the depths. These encounters would be memorable, certainly, but also fleeting, and likely infrequent on a long open ocean crossing. For the most part, your view would be devoid of such dramatic displays. Historians still debate how much active hunting or fishing Vikings did while at sea on these long voyages. While they were certainly capable fishermen, doing so from a moving longship in deep water would have been challenging, and the returns perhaps not always worth the effort compared to relying on preserved stores. A quirky and perhaps slightly disappointing tidbit for the aspiring Viking wildlife photographer, if such a thing existed, is that many of the more exotic sea creatures would remain unseen, hidden in the depths. You might occasionally spot a jellyfish, or a piece of floating seaweed that briefly looks like something more interesting, but the rich biodiversity of the ocean would largely pass you by, unobserved. So, you scan the horizon. Is that a fin? Nope, just an oddly shaped wave. Is that a flock of interesting migratory birds? No, just more gulls, probably complaining about the quality of your discarded hardtack. It's a slow, patient game of observation, where the rewards are few and far between, mostly just reinforcing the vast, beautiful, and often very empty nature of the sea around you. Your eyelids might start to droop as you follow the lazy flight of yet another single gull. As the days blur into an indistinguishable sameness, marked only by the slight variations in weather and the relentless cycle of meager meals and tedious chores, another casualty of the long Viking sea voyage begins to emerge. Conversation. In the initial days or weeks, there might have been a lively buzz. Stories of past adventures, boasts of future conquests, jokes, songs, perhaps even some heated debates about whose turn it was to bail the particularly smelly section of the bilge. But as the voyage stretches on, and the crushing monotony takes its toll, even the most talkative Viking might find their well of words running dry. Imagine the scene. At first, men would gather in small groups, sharing tales by the dim light of a flickering lamp or the faint glow of the stars. They'd speak of home, of families left behind, of hopes for the journey's end. It's a mainstream historical fact that oral storytelling was a vital part of Norse culture, a way to pass on history, myths, and social values. The sagas themselves are a testament to this rich tradition. On a long voyage, storytelling would have been a crucial way to pass the time and maintain morale. But even the most extensive repertoire of sagas and personal anecdotes has its limits. After you've heard Ulf's story about the time he almost caught a giant salmon for the 17th time, or Ragnar's detailed account of every single dent on his favorite shield, the novelty begins to wear thin. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the conversations would dwindle. The grand tales would give way to shorter, more practical exchanges. Past the water skin. Winds shifting. More gulls. Then, even these might become abbreviated, replaced by grunts, nods, or simply a shared, weary silence. The effort of formulating sentences, of engaging in social niceties,
might start to feel like too much work in the face of such overwhelming boredom and physical discomfort. What is there to say, after all, when every day is a carbon copy of the last? When the only view is unchanging water, and the only event of note is whether the dried fish is slightly more or less leathery than yesterday. Historians still argue about the psychological coping mechanisms Vikings used on these voyages, and how social cohesion was maintained when verbal communication faltered. Were there unspoken rules of conduct, a shared understanding that minimized friction in the enforced silence? Or did the lack of verbal outlet lead to simmering, unexpressed tensions? A quirky and perhaps relatable aspect of this conversational decline is the rise of repetitive complaints. If conversation did occur, it might well devolve into a litany of familiar grievances: the terrible food, the cramped conditions, the endless rocking, the questionable hygiene of your immediate neighbor. These complaints, while perhaps offering a momentary release, would themselves become part of the monotonous soundscape, as predictable and unchanging as the creak of the mast. You can almost feel the weight of that silence, punctuated only by the sounds of the ship and the occasional tired sigh. A world where words have lost their savor, where the effort of speech seems too great, and where the quiet, rhythmic sounds of the ocean are perhaps the only truly comforting voice left. Easy now, just let the silence and the gentle lapping of the waves carry you. So, conversation has dwindled to a series of grunts and weary sighs. The view is still, stubbornly, just water. The chores are done, for now. How then do you and your Viking shipmates attempt to pass the interminable, soul-crushingly dull hours that stretch between one meager meal and the next, one fitful sleep and another identical dawn? This is where the ingenuity, or perhaps the desperation of the Viking spirit might come into play, in the search for makeshift entertainment and boredom busters. Though, let's be honest, the options were probably as limited and uninspiring as the rations. Gambling, in various simple forms, was likely a popular pastime. It's a well-established historical fact that Vikings were fond of games of chance and skill. On board a cramped longship, this might have involved dice games, played with carved bone or wooden dice, perhaps wagering small personal items, a portion of their next meal, if anyone was feeling particularly reckless, or promises of future favors. You can imagine a small group huddled together. The click of dice, a tiny sound against the backdrop of wind and waves. A brief flicker of excitement in the otherwise monotonous gloom. They might also have played board games, like Nefatafel, a strategic game similar to chess, if they had a board and pieces that weren't too prone to sliding off with every lurch of the ship. Carving or whittling small objects from pieces of wood or bone could also have occupied some men. A quiet, solitary activity that produced a tangible result, however small. Music too might have played a role, though probably not in the form of a full Viking rock opera. Simple songs, perhaps work shanties sung to the rhythm of the oars, if they were rowing, or mournful ballads of home and hearth, could have provided some solace and a sense of shared experience. Someone might have had a small, portable instrument like a lyre or a flute, its plaintive notes a fragile melody against the vastness of the ocean. But even singing requires energy and a certain level of morale, both of which could be in short supply on a particularly arduous voyage. And after you've sung every verse of the Ballad of 1,000 Leaky Bilges for the dozenth time, even that might lose its charm. Historians still debate the extent to which Vikings engaged in physical contests or sports on board to pass time and maintain fitness. While space was incredibly limited, perhaps some form of wrestling or tests of strength could have occurred, though the risk of injury on a moving deck would have been significant. A quirky, and perhaps more likely form of entertainment, might have been simply observing and commenting on the ineptitude or misfortune of others. A dropped oar, a clumsy stumble, someone getting unexpectedly soaked by a wave. These minor mishaps could provide a moment of shared, if somewhat unkind, amusement. Or perhaps, in sheer desperation, they resorted to competitive staring contests, or seeing who could hold their breath the longest. The options were truly dire.
You can feel the weight of those empty hours, can't you? The desperate search for any small thing to break the relentless cycle of eat, sleep, stare, and bail. It's a quiet, slow, and deeply unexciting struggle against the encroaching tide of sheer, unadulterated boredom. Just imagine, nothing to do, nothing to see for hours and hours. Amidst the more obvious discomforts of a long Viking sea voyage, the bad food, the cramped quarters, the relentless motion, there lurked a quieter, more insidious anxiety. A constant, low-level worry that gnawed at the back of every crewman's mind. The dwindling supply of fresh water. Food, even terrible food, could be rationed and endured. But without fresh water, survival itself became a grim countdown. This wasn't a dramatic, sudden crisis, unless a barrel catastrophically failed, but rather a slow, creeping dread that grew with each passing day and each mouthful consumed. It's a mainstream historical fact that securing and storing an adequate supply of fresh water was one of the most critical logistical challenges for any long sea voyage in the age of sail. Vikings would have filled wooden casks or leather water skins before setting out, but on a journey lasting weeks or months, with dozens of men on board, these supplies were finite and precious. There was no desalinization plant, no convenient tap to turn. What they carried was all they had, until they could make landfall and find a spring or river. Each man would receive a daily ration, carefully measured out. And as the voyage wore on, and the water level in the barrels visibly dropped, that ration might become smaller and smaller. Imagine the psychological effect of this. Every sip of water, instead of just quenching thirst, would be a reminder of the diminishing supply. You'd watch the man in charge of doling out the rations with an eagle eye, scrutinizing every measure. The taste of the water itself would likely deteriorate over time, stored as it was in wooden containers. It might become stale, develop a woody or slimy taste, or even become slightly brackish if there was any seepage of seawater. But it was still life. The alternative, drinking seawater, was a swift route to dehydration and death, a fact well understood even then. So, you drink your portion, however unpleasant, and try not to think too much about how much was left, or how many more days, or weeks, you might be at sea. Historians still argue about the specific methods Vikings might have used to supplement their water supplies during a voyage, if any. Could they have collected rainwater if they had suitable awnings or containers? Perhaps, but rainfall in the open ocean can be unpredictable. Were they able to distill seawater using primitive methods? Unlikely, given the technology of the time and the fuel requirements. A quirky and rather desperate scenario might involve trying to catch morning dew, if conditions were right, by spreading out a sail or cloth, though the yield would be minimal. For the most part, they were entirely reliant on what they brought with them. You can feel that dry, scratchy sensation in your own throat, can't you? The slight, nagging thirst that never quite goes away. The quiet, persistent worry about that most essential of elements. It's a subtle undercurrent of anxiety, another layer of discomfort added to the already heaping pile. A slow, thirsty, monotonous countdown. Just the thought of that precious, dwindling water, so important, so scarce. While seasickness was undoubtedly a common and miserable affliction on these long voyages, it was by no means the only health concern your average Viking sailor had to contend with. Far from any healers, with only the most rudimentary medical knowledge and supplies on board, even minor illnesses and injuries could escalate into serious, life-threatening problems. The cramped, unhygienic conditions, the poor diet, and the constant exposure to the elements created a perfect breeding ground for a host of less dramatic, but equally debilitating ailments that added another layer of monotonous suffering to the journey. It's a well-established historical fact that nutritional deficiencies were a significant risk on long voyages. We've already discussed the uninspiring rations, often lacking in fresh fruits and vegetables. This could lead to conditions like scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, resulting in weakness, bleeding gums, tooth loss, and eventually, death. While Vikings may have unknowingly consumed some sources of vitamin C, perhaps in certain preserved berries or even, some theories suggest, in their weak ale if it was made with certain ingredients. A protracted voyage would almost certainly see some crew members succumbing to its debilitating effects. Imagine the misery of feeling your strength slowly drain away, your teeth loosening in your gums, all while still being expected to perform your share of the shipboard chores. Then there were the infections. Cuts, scrapes, and rope burns were common injuries from daily work on a ship. In the damp, dirty environment, with limited means to clean wounds properly, these could easily become infected, leading to painful swelling, fever, and potentially sepsis. Boils, skin rashes, and fungal infections would also thrive in such conditions. With no antibiotics, treatment would likely involve little more than washing with seawater, if available and deemed appropriate, applying a poultice of questionable herbs, if any were on board, or simply hoping for the best. Dental problems, too, would be a source of agony. A toothache or an abscess, with no dentist to turn to, could become an incapacitating torment. Historians still debate the contents of a Viking ship's medical kit, if such a formal thing even existed. It likely consisted of a few basic remedies known from folk medicine, perhaps some dried herbs for infusions, moss for wound dressing, or a sharp knife for lancing boils, a prospect that doesn't bear too much thinking about. A quirky and rather grim reality is that the doctor on board was probably just the crew member who seemed least squeamish or had the most experience dealing with injuries, often learned through a process of brutal trial and error. There was no sterile operating theater, no gentle bedside manner. You can almost feel that dull, throbbing ache of an infected wound, the gnawing pain of a bad tooth, or the debilitating weakness of a deficiency disease, all amplified by the knowledge that you are hundreds of miles from any real help, surrounded by nothing but water and the equally miserable groans of your shipmates. It's a slow, grinding attrition of health and well-being, another monotonous burden to endure. Just the constant, low-level ache, the feeling of being unwell, far from any comfort. After what feels like an eternity of gray waves, gray skies, and gray food, a new kind of monotony might begin to set in, if it hasn't already. The monotony of hope. Or rather, the repetitive, often fruitless, scanning of the horizon for any sign, any whisper, that this watery purgatory might finally be nearing its end. The hope for landfall, however faint and flickering, becomes a central focus, a desperate anchor in a sea of tedium. But even this hope can become a source of its own particular brand of weary repetition. Every morning as the first light touches the waves, and at intervals throughout the long, unchanging day, eyes would instinctively turn to the horizon. Is that a smudge? A darker line? A different shade of blue that might, just might, indicate the distant presence of land? It's a well-established historical fact that sighting land after a long sea voyage was an event of immense significance and relief. It meant fresh water, fresh food, a respite from the relentless motion of the ship, and the promise of achieving the voyage's objective, whatever that might be. The lookout, perched precariously at the masthead or the prow, would have the most critical, and perhaps most frustrating job. Their eyes would ache from the constant strain of searching, of trying to distinguish a genuine landmass from a cloud bank, a fog patch, or simply a trick of the light. Imagine the quiet tension, the unspoken question hanging in the air every time someone stares intently into the distance for a little too long. A ripple of anticipation might pass through the weary crew. Heads would turn. Conversations, if any were occurring, would cease. Everyone waiting, holding their breath. And then, more often than not, the watcher would shake their head, or sigh, and the moment would pass. The hope deflates, only to be cautiously rekindled a few hours later. This cycle of anticipation and disappointment, repeated day after day, week after week, could be incredibly draining. It's like waiting for a pot to boil, but the pot is the entire ocean,
and you have no idea if the stove is even on. Historians still argue about the precise range at which land could be sighted from a low-lying Viking longship, and how reliable early land sighting reports might have been. Mirages, atmospheric distortions, and simple wishful thinking could all lead to false alarms. A quirky and rather poignant detail from the Norse sagas is the use of ravens to find land. Vikings would release a raven, and if it didn't return, they would follow its flight path, assuming it had found land. If it circled and returned to the ship, it meant no land was near. This, while a clever navigational aid, also underscores the desperation and uncertainty involved. You can feel that little flicker of hope in your own chest, can't you? That yearning for something solid, something not water. And then the equally familiar sag as it fades away again. The horizon remains stubbornly empty. The ship sails on, and the wait, the long, monotonous wait, continues. Just waiting, and hoping, and waiting again. Beyond the general soul-crushing monotony of the endless sea and sky, the Viking voyage would also be punctuated by the specific and equally tedious miseries of whatever weather the Norse gods decided to throw at you. There was no escaping it. You were entirely at the mercy of the elements, and each type of inclement weather brought its own unique brand of discomfort and repetitive endurance. Whether it was freezing rain, relentless sun, or the deadening calm of becalmed seas, the weather was just another variable in the equation of your ongoing monotonous suffering. Imagine enduring days of freezing, sleet-filled rain. It's a mainstream historical fact that North Atlantic weather can be brutal, even in summer. There's no cozy cabin to retreat to. You're out in it, huddled in your damp woolen cloak, the icy water seeping through every layer, chilling you to the bone. Your hands are numb, your feet are blocks of ice, and every movement is an effort. The deck becomes slick and treacherous. The sail, heavy with water, slaps and cracks in the wind, and the rain just keeps on falling. A gray, relentless, miserable curtain, obscuring the already featureless horizon, making everything damper, colder, and more wretched than it already was. The only sound is the drumming of rain on the deck, and the miserable slosh of water in the bilge. It's a monotony of shivering and damp despair. Then there's the opposite extreme. Days of relentless, scorching sun in a cloudless sky. The tar on the ship's timbers might soften and bubble, releasing its acrid fumes. The unshaded deck becomes an oven. Your skin burns, your lips crack, and the meager water ration does little to quench your parched throat. The glare off the water is blinding, making your eyes ache. There's no escape from the heat, no cool breeze, just the oppressive, baking stillness, the sun beating down mercilessly, hour after hour. The monotony here is one of simmering discomfort, a slow cooking in your own salty sweat, the air thick and heavy, making every breath feel like an effort. And perhaps worst of all, in terms of sheer, mind-numbing frustration for a sailor, were the periods of being becalmed. The wind dies completely. The great square sail, your primary means of propulsion, hangs limp and useless from the mast. The ship drifts aimlessly, making no progress, a tiny speck on a vast glassy sea. The silence after days or weeks of wind and waves can be unnerving. The heat builds, the rations dwindle, and there is absolutely nothing you can do but wait, and wait, and wait for a breeze that may or may not come. This is the monotony of utter helplessness, of being stalled and stagnant, each hour stretching into an eternity of impatient inactivity. Historians still debate how Viking crews coped with these periods of enforced idleness and the psychological toll it must have taken. A quirky and rather desperate measure might have involved whistling for the wind, a common sailor's superstition, though likely as effective as trying to boil a cauldron with a single candle. Each type of weather, whether too wet, too hot, or too still, brought its own flavor of repetitive misery. Another turn of the screw in the long, slow torture of the voyage. You can almost feel that oppressive stillness of a becalmed sea, can't you? The utter lack of movement, the waiting, the endless, silent, patient waiting. Now let's consider the very basic human need for sleep on this monotonous yet perpetually uncomfortable Viking longship. You might think that after a long day of tedious chores, enduring bad weather, and consuming questionable rations, sleep would come easily. But restorative, peaceful slumber was likely another luxury that was in very short supply. Sleeping in shifts, if you were lucky enough to have a system that organized, was probably the norm. But the quality of that sleep would have been far from ideal. It's a well-established historical fact that on any working vessel, continuous watchfulness is necessary. The ship doesn't sail itself, and dangers can arise at any time, day or night. This means the crew would have been divided into watches, or shifts, with one group responsible for sailing and vigilance while the others attempted to rest. The length of these watches could vary, but you can imagine that after hours of straining your eyes in the dark, or wrestling with the sail in a stiff breeze, you'd be exhausted. But then came the challenge of actually finding a place to sleep, and then staying asleep. Remember those cramped conditions? You'd be trying to wedge yourself into your allotted sliver of deck space, surrounded by the snores, coughs, and restless movements of your off-duty shipmates, not to mention those still on duty moving about. The constant motion of the ship, which we've discussed, would be a major impediment to deep sleep for many. Just as you're drifting off, a larger wave might hit, sending a jarring shudder through the vessel, or causing you to roll uncomfortably. The creaking of the timbers, the groan of the mast, the slap of waves against the hull. These sounds, while perhaps eventually fading into a sort of background drone for some, could easily keep lighter sleepers in a state of semi-wakefulness. And then there were the temperature fluctuations. You might fall asleep shivering under a thin woolen blanket, only to wake up a few hours later sweating profusely if the wind died and the air became still and humid, or if the sun began to bake the deck. Historians still argue about the typical sleep duration and patterns for Viking sailors. It's unlikely they enjoyed long, uninterrupted nights of 8 hours. More probable is a pattern of fragmented sleep, snatched in relatively short bursts whenever opportunity and exhaustion coincided. A quirky and rather unpleasant detail to consider is the likelihood of being woken abruptly, not by a gentle nudge, but by a kick to the ribs as your replacement for the next watch arrives, or by a sudden downpour of icy rain if you are sleeping exposed on deck. There's no snooze button on a Viking longship. When it's your turn to be on duty, you get up, no matter how little sleep you've had or how bone-weary you feel. You can almost feel that groggy disorientation, can't you? The feeling of being dragged from a shallow, unsatisfying sleep, your body still aching, your mind still foggy, to face another round of monotonous vigilance or back-breaking labor. It's a cycle of weariness, a constant sleep deficit that would add yet another layer to the overall sense of fatigue and monotony. Just imagine that heavy, leaden feeling of never being truly rested, always a little tired, always a little sleepy. We've talked a lot about the physical discomforts, the cramped space, the bad food, the relentless motion, the often miserable weather, the lack of good sleep. But woven through all of this, and perhaps amplified by it, is another constant feature of life on a long Viking sea voyage: the utter, absolute lack of privacy. In a world where you are never more than a few feet, often just a few inches, from your fellow crewmen, the concept of personal space becomes a forgotten, almost mythical luxury. It's a mainstream historical fact that Viking longships were open vessels. There were no private cabins, no little nooks to retreat to for a moment of solitude. Every aspect of your existence, from the most mundane to the most personal, was lived out in full view, or at least within earshot, of everyone else on board. Eating, as we've established, was a communal, and likely somewhat competitive, affair. Sleeping was a tangled mass of humanity. Even the most basic bodily functions had to be attended to with a distinct lack of seclusion, typically at a designated spot over the rail, a process that offered little in the way of dignity, especially in rough seas, or under the curious gaze of your shipmates. Imagine the psychological toll of this constant exposure. There's no opportunity to quietly process your thoughts, to nurse a private grief, or simply to be alone with your own anxieties without someone noticing, commenting, or perhaps just being there. If you were feeling unwell, your discomfort was public. If you were in a bad mood, there was no hiding it. Every sigh, every frown, every muttered curse was potentially observed and registered by those around you. This enforced intimacy could, in some circumstances, foster a strong sense of camaraderie and shared experience. But it could equally, especially on a long and arduous voyage where tempers were frayed and patience wore thin, lead to intense irritation and social friction. The man who snores like a walrus, the one who constantly hums off key, the one who has a particularly pungent body odor even by Viking sea dog standards. These minor annoyances, inescapable and ever-present, could magnify into sources of genuine resentment. Historians still debate how Vikings managed to maintain social order and individual sanity in such an environment of zero privacy. Were there strict unwritten codes about not prying into others' business, even when that business was happening right next to you? Or was a certain level of gruff communal tolerance simply part of the expected seafaring mindset? A quirky, and perhaps slightly unsettling, thought is that even your dreams might not feel entirely private. Muttering in your sleep or thrashing about during a nightmare would be immediately apparent to those pressed up against you. There was no shield, no barrier, no personal bubble. You were, for weeks or months on end, an open book, whether you liked it or not. You can feel that sensation, can't you? The feeling of being constantly observed. No place to hide, no moment truly your own. Just the constant presence of others, always there, always close. In the midst of the vast, indifferent ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest workshop or skilled craftsman, what happened when something on the Viking longship broke? And things, inevitably, would break. Ropes would snap, oars would splinter, sailcloth would tear. Even structural timbers might crack under the relentless stress of the sea. The task of repairing these damages, often with limited tools and materials, in challenging conditions, was another source of frustrating, repetitive labor that punctuated the otherwise monotonous voyage. It was a constant battle against entropy, a make-do and mend existence where ingenuity and patience were as vital as brute strength. It's a well-established historical fact that Viking crews had to be largely self-sufficient in terms of maintenance and repair while at sea. They would have carried a basic toolkit: axes, adzes, knives, awls, hammers, perhaps a saw or two, and materials for patching and splicing, like spare rope, leather, and pieces of wood. But these resources were finite. If a major piece of equipment failed, like a mast splitting or the steering oar breaking, it could be a catastrophic event, potentially leaving the ship disabled and at the mercy of the elements. More common, however, would be the endless succession of smaller, nagging repairs. Imagine trying to splice a frayed rope on a pitching deck, your fingers cold and stiff, the salt spray stinging your eyes. Or attempting to patch a tear in the heavy, unwieldy sail while it's still partially hoisted, the wind threatening to rip it from your grasp. Carving a new thole pin for an oar, or reinforcing a cracked bench, would be slow, meticulous work, often done in awkward, cramped positions. These weren't quick fixes. They were often laborious, time-consuming efforts to coax a little more life out of worn-out gear. And as soon as one repair was completed, it seemed another problem would inevitably arise. The sea is a harsh mistress, constantly testing the integrity of the vessel and everything on it. Historians still argue about the level of specialized skill within a typical Viking crew. Was there a designated ship's carpenter or sailmaker? Or were these skills more generally distributed among the experienced seamen? It's likely a bit of both, with some individuals having more aptitude or experience in certain types of repair. A quirky and rather frustrating aspect of these at-sea repairs would be the improvisation required.
You might not have the perfectly shaped piece of wood or the ideal type of cordage. So you'd have to make do with what you had, fashioning a less than perfect solution that would hopefully hold until you could make a more permanent repair on land. This constant patching and mending, this ongoing effort to keep the ship functional, was a testament to Viking resourcefulness. But it was also another layer of tedious, repetitive work, a reminder of their isolation and dependence on their own limited resources. You can almost feel the splinters in your fingers, the ache in your back from hunching over a difficult repair, the frustration of a job that never quite feels finished, just mending and patching and mending again. Beyond the physical hardships and the mind-numbing boredom, there's a quieter, more insidious toll that a long Viking sea voyage could take: the psychological impact of profound isolation. For weeks, perhaps months, you and your shipmates are a tiny, self-contained universe, adrift in an immense emptiness, cut off from the familiar sights, sounds, and social connections of the world you left behind. This prolonged separation, this feeling of being utterly removed from the rest of humanity, could lead to a quiet, creeping mental fatigue, a subtle fraying of the spirit. It's a mainstream historical fact that humans are social creatures, and prolonged isolation, even in the company of others, if those others are the only others, can have significant psychological effects. On land, even in a small Viking settlement, there was a wider community, a connection to the rhythms of the seasons, the sight of familiar landscapes, the news and gossip from neighboring farms. At sea, all of that is gone. Your world shrinks to the confines of the ship, your social circle to the same faces you see day in and day out. There are no new stimuli, no fresh perspectives, just the endless repetition of the voyage and the increasingly familiar, and perhaps increasingly irritating, quirks of your companions. Imagine the longing for news from home, wondering how your family is faring, if the crops were good, if that dispute with the neighboring village ever got resolved. There are no letters, no messages, no way to know what's happening in the world beyond your watery horizon. This sense of being disconnected, of being in a kind of temporal and spatial limbo, could be deeply unsettling. The future is uncertain. Will you reach your destination? Will the voyage be successful? Will you even survive to return? And the past, the life you left behind, can start to feel distant and dreamlike. All that exists, with an oppressive, monotonous certainty, is the present moment, on this ship, in this endless ocean. Historians still debate the specific cultural or psychological mechanisms that helped Vikings endure such isolation. Was it their fatalistic worldview, their belief in destiny and the will of the Norns? Was it the strong bonds of camaraderie forged in shared hardship? Or did they simply develop a kind of stoic, uncomplaining resilience as a matter of survival? A quirky and perhaps understandable manifestation of this isolation might be an increased tendency towards superstition or seeing omens in everyday occurrences. A strange cloud formation, an unusual bird, a dream. These might take on a heightened significance in a world starved of external input. You can feel that sense of detachment, can't you? That feeling of being adrift, not just physically, but mentally. The world shrinking, thoughts turning inward, the quiet, relentless hum of isolation, a slow, steady, empty feeling. As the monotonous days and weeks at sea grind on, with their unchanging vistas, unappetizing rations, and unrelenting discomfort, it's only natural that your mind would seek an escape. And where better to escape to, in the absence of any external diversion, than the fertile, if somewhat starved, landscape of your own imagination? Daydreams of dry land, of warm fires, of food that doesn't taste predominantly of salt and regret, would become a frequent, and perhaps increasingly desperate, pastime for the weary Viking sailor. Picture yourself, huddled against the gunwale, trying to find a position that doesn't make every bone in your body ache. The ship creaks, the waves slap,
Your stomach rumbles with a familiar, dull emptiness. And so, you close your eyes, or perhaps just let your gaze unfocus on the distant, hazy horizon, and you let your mind wander. You conjure up the image of your home, the familiar smell of wood smoke from your own hearth, the feel of solid earth beneath your feet that doesn't constantly sway and pitch. It's a well-established psychological coping mechanism to engage in pleasant fantasies when faced with unpleasant realities. And for the Viking at sea, these fantasies would almost certainly revolve around the comforts and certainties of life on land. You might spend hours meticulously reconstructing, in your mind's eye, every detail of your farm. The way the sunlight falls on the south-facing field in the late afternoon, the specific gnarled branch on the old oak tree by the river, the contented grunting of your pigs, or perhaps your daydreams turn to food. Oh, the food. You imagine a lavish feast, roasted meat, dripping with fat and juices, not the leathery, salt-encrusted stuff you've been gnawing on for weeks. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, not weevil-infested hardtack. Sweet, ripe berries, bursting with flavor. And ale. Rich, dark, foaming ale, served in your favorite drinking horn, not the stale, brackish water that barely wets your tongue. These culinary fantasies would be vivid, detailed, and utterly torturous in their delicious unattainability. Historians still argue about how much of the Viking spirit was about enduring hardship versus actively seeking adventure and wealth. But even the most hardened adventurer likely yearned for simple comforts during the brutal monotony of a long sea voyage. A quirky and rather telling detail from some sagas involves warriors boasting not just of battles won, but of the lavish feasts they enjoyed, or the comfortable halls they resided in, suggesting that these earthly pleasures were highly valued. So, you drift in your daydream. You feel the warmth of the fire. You taste the imaginary feast. You hear the laughter of loved ones. It's a temporary respite, a fragile bubble of pleasure in an ocean of discomfort. But even these pleasant daydreams are, in their own way, monotonous. They are a repetition of desire, a constant yearning for what you do not have. And eventually, you have to open your eyes, and you're still there, on the ship, with the same endless water, and the same terrible food waiting for you. Just the gentle pull of those dreams, soft, warm, comforting, away from this endless rocking. After what feels like an eternity of staring at that same, infuriatingly empty horizon, a cry might go up from the lookout, a shout of excitement, a pointing finger. Could it be? Has the monotony finally been broken? Is that land? A surge of adrenaline, a flicker of genuine, unadulterated hope, courses through the weary crew. Everyone scrambles for a view, eyes straining, hearts pounding. This could be it, the end of the voyage, the promise of fresh water, real food, solid ground. But then, as the ship draws a little closer, or as the light changes, the crushing reality dawns. It's not land. It's just another cloud bank, low on the horizon, deceptively solid-looking from a distance. Or perhaps it's a particularly dense patch of fog, or even a distant shimmering mirage, a cruel trick of the light and tired eyes. The initial surge of excitement crashes into a wave of profound disappointment. It's a false alarm. The voyage isn't over. The monotony will continue. This experience, the false hope followed by the disheartening letdown, is a particular kind of torment, a cruel punctuation mark in the otherwise featureless narrative of the journey. It's a mainstream historical fact that accurately identifying distant land from sea, especially in variable weather conditions and without modern optical aids, was incredibly challenging. Viking navigators were skilled, but they weren't infallible. And the psychological desire to see land, to believe the ordeal was ending, could easily lead to wishful thinking and misinterpretation of ambiguous visual cues. Imagine the scene, the momentary, exultant clamor as the land sighting is announced, the scramble for position, the pointing, the excited chatter, and then the slow, dawning silence as the truth becomes apparent. Shoulders slump, weary sighs are exchanged. Someone might mutter a curse under their breath. The brief spark of energy dissipates, leaving behind an even deeper sense of fatigue and resignation. Historians still debate how frequently such false alarms might have occurred on long Viking voyages, and the cumulative impact they had on crew morale. Each instance would be a small emotional roller coaster, a brief, sharp spike of hope, followed by a disheartening plunge. A quirky and rather human reaction to such a disappointment might be a temporary surge of grumbling or even anger, directed at the unfortunate lookout who made the mistaken call, or perhaps just at the indifferent gods who seemed to be toying with them. But even this anger would likely fade quickly, subsumed by the overwhelming weariness and the acceptance of their ongoing monotonous plight. You can almost feel that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach, can't you? The hope, so bright for a moment, now extinguished. The horizon, once again, just an empty line. And the ship just sails on into more of the same, endless, unchanging water. And so, as our own sleepy voyage through the crushing monotony of a Viking sea journey draws towards its close, let us imagine just for a moment that this time it's real. After weeks, perhaps months, of that relentless, unchanging seascape, of terrible rations and cramped discomfort, a genuine smudge appears on the horizon. It doesn't disappear. It grows, slowly, tantalizingly, taking on the definite shape of land. Hills, perhaps. Trees, maybe. The end, it seems, is finally in sight. But even as a surge of profound relief washes over you, a subtle question might linger in the back of your exhausted mind. Will even landfall truly break the deeply ingrained monotony, the habits of endurance and resignation that have become second nature? Or is this just a transition to a different kind of tedium? The final approach to land would be a period of intense, focused activity, a stark contrast to the listless boredom of the open ocean. Sails would be adjusted, steering would become more critical, lookouts would be doubly vigilant for coastal hazards like rocks and reefs. There'd be a buzz of anticipation, a renewed energy, however tired the crew. This is a well-established historical pattern. The final push often brings a surge of adrenaline. But what comes after? If it's an uninhabited shore where you're stopping for fresh water and repairs, the chores will continue, albeit on solid ground. If it's a known settlement, there will be the business of docking, unloading, perhaps trading or other Viking activities. But even these, after the initial novelty, can settle into their own routines. You've spent so long in a state of suspended animation, a world defined by the rocking of the ship and the taste of salt, that the sudden intrusion of solid, unmoving earth and the complexities of terrestrial life might feel almost overwhelming, even alien. The quiet, the lack of constant motion, the sheer variety of smells that aren't tar or bilge water. It will take time to readjust. And there's a part of you, perhaps, that has become so accustomed to the simple, brutal rhythm of the sea voyage that the demands of life ashore, with its myriad small decisions and social interactions, might seem almost tiring in a new way. Historians still argue about the long-term psychological effects of these voyages on the Vikings who undertook them. Did they return changed men, forever marked by the vastness of the ocean and the endurance it demanded? Or did they slip back into their land-based lives with relative ease, the memory of the monotonous journey fading like a dream? A quirky and perhaps fitting final thought is that even the more in tonight's title, those other little miseries and discomforts we've touched upon, all contributed to that overarching sense of crushing monotony. Each individual hardship, from the itchy blankets to the nagging thirst, was a single dull note in a long, repetitive, and deeply unmelodious symphony of the sea. But now, as you yourself feel the gentle pull of sleep,
Let that symphony fade. Let the rocking stop. Let the endless horizon dissolve. The voyage is over, at least for tonight. The land is here, soft and still beneath you. There is no more need for vigilance, no more terrible rations to endure. Just the quiet comfort of your own bed, the gentle rhythm of your own breath. The crushing monotony has given way to a crushing and deeply welcome sense of peace. Allow yourself to drift now into that calm, still harbor of sleep. Sweet dreams.